I introduced you to the class already. We're very happy to have you here. And you're wanting to talk about whatever you like, but we would certainly like to hear about your books and how you got involved with parapsychology. But anything else that's on the table is great.
Thank
So
you.
take it away.
Very good. Thank you, Sally, and hello to everyone. I wish I could be there with you in person, but I have commitments that make it necessary for me to be here in New York City, where I'm speaking to you from. But I'm glad that we can at least meet in this fashion. Um, I've written for many years as a historian of alternative spirituality. I call myself a believing historian. I think transparency is very important for the historical writer. We're all coming from a particular direction or point of view. And in fact, I would say that most everyone in the field of religious history is a believing historian to the extent that he or she emerges from the congregation being written about, maybe from one wing of it, maybe from an apostate point of view, maybe from a more traditional point of view. But regardless, histories of almost every religious or spiritual movement or development come from the congregations or from adjacencies to those congregations that are being written about, obviously with some exception. But in my case, I've always been interested in the extra-physical, which is my definition of spirituality. I have always harbored a deep-seated belief that the individual participates in an existence that is more than just flesh and bone, motor skill, standard cognition. As I often say, the dominant Western point of view, less so, quite frankly, within the hard sciences than within within social sciences and the humanities. The dominant, and by dint of downstream effect, media, reference sources like Wikipedia, the dominant Western point of view is one of philosophical materialism or strict physicalism. The notion being that the mind is an epiphenomenon of the gray matter of the brain. And once physical death occurs, once the brain is organically gone, the mind is gone, just like bubbles in a carbonated glass of water. And the water is gone, the bubbles are gone, and that's that. That doesn't fit the human story. It hasn't fit the human story in terms of testimony over the ages, but unique to the 21st century, it doesn't fit the story of the hard sciences. We live in an age in which perceptual based reality, um, quantum mechanics, quantum computing, and the questions that's placing us in front of about interdimensionality and different intersections of time, about which I'll try to say another word, um, entirely challenge the materialist viewpoint. We live in a 21st century world in which almost 95, nearly 100 years of experiments in quantum mechanics have impelled us as a human community to reach the logical necessity that not only does perception play into reality in a very concrete way, not just in terms of I think or I feel something as a matter of the five senses, but perception, in fact, concretizes physical locality, physical experience. We see this in the particle lab, and we're seeing these qualities and these questions deepen in other sciences like neuroplasticity, which demonstrates through brain scans that our thoughts, whatever a thought may be, an interesting question by itself, actually change the gray matter of our brain. It's a flipping of the physicalist premise that mind emerges from brain. In fact, the field of neuroplasticity, which is a fairly young science, but also a non controversial science, which is why I frequently draw upon its example, demonstrates that a sustained thought that you hold actually alters the neural pathways through which electrical impulses travel in the brain. It's mind over matter on a biological level. And there are any number of other examples of the materialist assumption that we're simply moist robots, as Dilbert would put it, or that we're just advanced apes capable of aspects of motor skill that are born out of a complexity of biology, and that's it. That's the totality of life. It no longer stands up in our 21st century era. I made reference to quantum uh, computing, which hasn't even been exposed to the public yet, which is still in its prototype form. But as some of you may have read in Science News, in late 2024, Google's engineers released a statement that they had performed an experiment with their quantum computing prototype, which is named Willow, in which they submitted to Willow a math problem of such complexity that it was estimated to require um, 10 septillion years to solve. That's 10 to the 25th power. And that 10 septillion years, this inconceivable number, is older than the age and projected lifespan of the universe itself. So, in terms of the standard arrow of time, so to speak, this math problem was considered impossible. Time is really just a measurement of something. We don't fully know what time is, but to speak colloquially, there isn't enough time in the universe to solve this problem that was submitted to Willow. And yet, the engineers reported Willow produced an accurate answer in under 5 minutes. And in their statement, they said that this result provides evidence for the existence of a multiverse. In other words, a infinitude of multiple dimensions in which the answer exists somewhere. The premise being that Willow plucked the answer, so to speak, from a different intersection of time. And when you start to get into these questions of there existing events and information and occurrences in different intersections of time in a world that's existent everywhere all at once, you start to see the convergence between millennia of religious belief and other forms of spiritual belief and actual data emergent from the hard sciences suggesting that this is not just an idea that is a useful plot device or that we like to kind of theorize about over a beer in the graduate student lounge somewhere, but that this is actual concrete reality. More so, it's a logical necessity. And this is what feeds into my deep interest in parapsychology, a field that I have not even mentioned. Parapsychology is the academic study of what might be called extraphysicality or non-locality on the scale of the individual. It is a branch of psychology, and parapsychology, I would say, measures cognitively or in the experience of the individual psyche what the Google engineers were referring to on a computational scale. And parapsychology has been doing this itself for close to 100 years. Now, when I talk about extraphysicality or non-locality, I'm talking about things that we refer to in general terms as extrasensory perception or ESP, telepathy, clairvoyance, near-death experiences, experiences of after-physical survival, questions of reincarnation, everything and anything that feeds into the extra-physical existence of the psyche, of the human experience, of the human story, a story that has been tracked through data in the field of parapsychology, at least here in this country, in the United States, going back probably to the late 1920s through the work of my intellectual hero, J.B. Rhines, someone with whom your instructor, Sally, had the great privilege to be acquainted, along with some other very significant figures in the field of parapsychology. J.B. and his wife, an intellectual partner, Louisa, uh, ventured to Duke University in the late 1920s, where they opened what would eventually become known as the parapsychology lab. And their intention was to test for ESP, extrasensory perception, in very simple, replicable, and methodologically rigorous conditions. And to do this, JB and his colleagues devised a 5-suit deck of cards known as Zener cards. And Zener cards are fairly recognizable images: a star, a circle, a square, squiggly lines, a cross, that are assembled in a deck of 20 cards. And again, there are 5 suits. Um, and so, I mean, these numbers can, of course, vary. Um, but what you'll find over and over is that in JB's experiments, subjects were asked to make a random guess on the cards that were being laid down. And I said 20 cards. That was an error. I'm sorry. A Zener card deck is 25 cards. It's a 5-suit deck of 25 cards. And so if you're making a guess over time and over a span of numbers, you're going to hit 1 out of 5 or 25%. But what JB found repeatedly and over thousands and thousands of trials, which eventually swelled into a million trials in his database by 1940, is that certain individuals were consistently and over very large spans of numbers outscoring the guess rate of the expected 25%. They might have been hitting 26, 27, 28%, and in some cases, a good deal higher. And the crunched data demonstrated this. It demonstrated that there is some kind of anomalous transfer of information, trackable in a laboratory setting, that exceeds the abilities of our known 5 senses and all known technology. And JB labored with such intensity to ensure that both the methods and the stats were completely unpolluted and pristine. He opened his books, so to speak, literally and figuratively, to every skeptic, every scientist who was interested in the topic, every mathematician who cared to check his numbers. His numbers, as it turns out, were absolutely pristine. Authorities from various grant-making foundations, as well as the American Statistical Association, reviewed his numbers and deemed them unpolluted. His methods were constantly varied, were performed in such a way that they were as methodologically airtight, I would say, that anything that's come out of the uh, modern data gathering lab. And yet they contained an anomaly that could not be accepted within many precincts of mainstream science. Although, as I alluded earlier, nowadays, although there is vociferous pushback against parapsychology in general, that pushback is chiefly within journalism, social sciences, reference media, Wikipedia in particular, and the humanities. It is less heard within the hard sciences, physics, engineering, biology, chemistry, for the very reason that, as the Google engineers themselves were alluding in their very specific statement, the more accurately you measure life, the more it misbehaves, the weirder and weirder it gets. Uh, J.B. Rhine's initial experiments have been repeated and replicated dozens of times, and many, many other data surpassing even JB's data has been gathered. One of the figures that Sally had the great privilege to work with was a next generation parapsychologist, Charles Honorton, who died very young in 1996. And losing Honorton was, as I often say, the near equivalent to losing Einstein at the dawn of his relativity theories. Honorton was interested in testing whether ESP, telepathy, clairvoyance might spike under certain conditions. And he had a hunch that the occurrence of ESP might spike under conditions of very relaxed, comfortable sensory deprivation, a state that is called hypnagogia. The hypnagogic state is one that you actually enter twice a day naturally, just in those few moments of exquisite relaxation just before you fall to sleep at night, and again just as you're coming to in the morning. You're very relaxed in body. Your eyes are closed. Might be experiencing some dreamlike states or hallucinations, but you have active cognition. You can direct your attention. You can receive instructions. And what Anderton did was to test for telepathy by placing a subject into this hypnagogic state, this waking state of exquisitely deep relaxation, a sensory deprived state. And Honorton tested for the subject's accuracy in receiving images, so to speak, that were transmitted by a sender who was seated in a different room. And the idea of these experiments, which were called the Gansfeld experiments, was that if you assemble four images and you make an effort to send one of those images, one being accurate, the other three being decoys, to the receiver, who might be in some sort of a isolation tank or a sensory deprivation tank, very relaxed, on the brink of sleep, but not sleeping. If you were to attempt to transmit, so to speak, one of these four images, again, as with JB's experiments, instead of a one of five um, guess hit rate, you get a one of four guess hit rate. Honorton's numbers were off the map in a certain sense. He was getting higher hit rates statistically than what even JB was getting himself. His hit rates were, instead of 20%, were coming in maybe in the low 30s, maybe the mid 30s, maybe the high 30s, 35, 36, 37%. The numbers were even higher, and the data was pristine. Honorton took the unprecedented step of collaborating with an avowed skeptic of ESP, a man who's still living, named Ray Hyman, who's a emeritus professor of psychology at the University of Oregon. And Ray and he came to the conclusion that the numbers and the data were unpolluted. Ray would not concede the ESP thesis. He didn't agree with the ESP thesis, and he does not today. But he did say that these numbers are pure, these hit rates are pure, they're valid, they're reasonable, and it warrants further research. That effort has never repeated, partly because Honorton died at a very young age, and he was 42. He had suffered from lifelong health problems, and partly because um, Ray Hyman himself is part of a professional skeptic apparatus that seems to regard any concession of the existence of ESP as a slippery slope to irrationality. And I reject that. I don't see how pure questioning, pure research, pure science can ever open us up to irrationality. To me, it's anti-intellectualism itself. To say that because something violates common observation, it must be wrong, it would have us still believing that the sun circulated around the earth rather than the other way around. Of course, we had overwhelming evidence, evidence that couldn't be ignored, that the earth circulates around the sun. And we had to embrace that evidence to save ourselves from absurdity. We're in a similar situation with parapsychology today. We face absurdity as a human community if we sublimate this data, if we wipe away this data. I want to mention one more case, and then I'm going to return to that point, and then I'll open things up to questions, dialogue, exchange. Um, there's a living scientist, well, there's several living scientists who have engaged in the study of precognition. Precognition being the ability to sense something before it happens, which, according to our standard perception of time, ought not be possible. And yet, um, our standard perception of time um, is based upon classical physics, classical Newtonian physics, in which the arrow of time moves in only one direction and simply cannot be reversed. That is a truth within classical physics. It's sometimes referred to as the second law of thermodynamics. To put it in a simple way, an egg broken cannot be unbroken, and that's that. And we understand that as reality. But when you're examining things with sharper and sharper instruments, just like looking at something under a high-powered microscope, you see more and more of what's going on, and the world gets weirder and weirder. Now, the concept of retrocausality or backwards causation, something that's not supposed to work, is recognized today as a valid field um, within quantum physics. In fact, the great physicist Richard Feynman himself, who, by the way, would not agree with anything that I'm saying, but the great Richard Feynman himself won the Nobel Prize in Physics in 1965 for his experiments with a subatomic particle called a positron, which reverses charges and, if in actuality, not metaphorically or in some pretty language, moves backwards in time. This is part of this is part of what Einstein called spooky action at a distance. He was referring to quantum entanglement, where particles or much larger objects, sometimes celestial objects, very plainly affect one another at great distances with no evident connection. Why is this happening? Well, this raises the question of many worlds, interdimensionality, string theory, other intersections of time. So, um, among the two great scientists, living scientists who study precognition are Dean Radin, friend of mine, and Darrell Bem. And their innovation was to raise the question of whether what I've just been describing to you in terms of retrocausality exists on the cognitive level as well. Maybe it's not just restricted to the particle lab. A law, in order to be a law, must be universal, which doesn't mean it's ever operative in the same way, because universal laws, like gravity, are affected by other conditions. Gravity is affected by mass. Uh, Weather fronts are affected by um, countervailing weather fronts. Water is always H2O, but it can be vapor, solid, liquid, depending upon temperature. So a natural law must be ever operative, but it doesn't mean it's always going to function the same way. In any case, Bem embarked on a very innovative series of experiments at Cornell University, which he published in 2011. And in the most dramatic trials of his series of precognition experiments, and I'm going to really condense this down, and it's going to blow your mind. Just happens to be true. Bem found that if a student or a subject studies for an exam, listen to this very carefully. If a student or subject studies for an exam after the exam has been taken and scored, it will, by a few percentage points on average, spike his or her score. It's impossible, right? How does that happen? It can't work. violates all common observation. Just happens to be true. Now, there were howls of pushback after Bem published this data in a very widely respected, juried, scholarly psychology journal. Howls of pushback. Good old Ray Hyman, who I mentioned earlier, told the New York Times, I think I'm quoting this verbatim. It's been imprinted on my mind. It's craziness, pure craziness. It's an embarrassment to the whole field. You go on Wikipedia today, and you will find on Wikipedia this is pseudoscience. This is nonsense. It hasn't been replicated. It's been overturned. It's fantasy. It's embarrassment. Let me tell you the truth. The truth is that Darrell's experiments into backwards causation or retrocausality were, over the course of about a decade, retried, retested, and replicated, and proven confirmatory in a meta-analysis, which is a group study of not identical but similar experiments, a meta-analysis consisting of 90 experiments, including the originals, in 33 different labs in 14 different nations. 90 experiments in 33 different labs in 14 different nations, as well as in other languages, including Italian. I'm not telling you that each one of these 90 experiments succeeded. They did not. That's not what a meta-analysis does. A meta-analysis looks to demonstrate that the results of the initial experiments, if they were positive, were not just chance. And Bem's data proved confirmatory in a meta-analysis that is larger by numbers than those supporting most common pharmaceuticals that you and I are taking. The data is bulletproof. Now, let me share something with you. Last time I addressed Sally's class, I wasn't aware of this, but I became aware of it recently. A non-confirmatory replication of Bem's experiments was published in 2023. And I wrote an article about Darrell on Substack called Is Precognition Real? And a critic wrote to me and said, hey, this experiment was replicated in 2023 and it failed. And I responded at length to my interlocutor. I appreciated this being made known to me. I won't say too much about it here. If you want to read my article, you can find it in the article, Is Precognition Real? On Substack. I'm adding an addendum to it. But what I want to say to you is no single experiment proves anything. The name of the game in science is replication, replication, replication. The scientific method itself is methodological replication. Darrell's experiments were rerun and proven in an enormous meta-analysis relative to the standards of the social sciences, standards that I think are very problematic, by the way, standards that I think parapsychology has, in fact, improved dramatically over the years. And his findings proved confirmatory by um, a multiple of more than four times what would be expected if they were attributable to chance. In short, the findings are real, in as much as we can say anything is real in this quantum-based reality bending perceptual stage of life in which we all can't figure out whether we actually live inside of a computer simulation. The data are as real as it gets in terms of experiments with human cognition. And yet it's very, I'm going to change what I was going to say. I was going to say it's very difficult. It's more than difficult. It's more than difficult for people who abide strict physicalism to accept this material. They don't weigh the data and either accept or reject it. They can't perceive it. They can't perceive it. There's some kind of blockage that renders them incapable of perceiving the psychological equivalent of the Earth traveling around the sun. It violates common observation. It's too violative of premises on which Western culture has based itself over the past 300 or so years. And even though it, the parapsychology thesis, the ESP thesis, has amassed evidence probably surpassing the quality and quantity of most within the social sciences, it is treated like heretical misinformation. And you will find this. You will find this. If you go onto Wiki after class, you will discover that everything I've told you is wrong. It's silly, it's nonsense, it's a mistake, it's a misunderstanding. It hasn't been replicated, it hasn't been proven, it's been overturned. And this is why, if you look at my writing on the material, including this article I mentioned, Is Precognition Real? I will provide you with sources and references that you can check yourself that come from positions supporting the data and opposing the data so that you, as if a member or a foreman on a jury, can make a reasonable judgment call. Because such a successful campaign has been waged in the media and within reference sources against parapsychology that the actual results and the verity of the results have been obfuscated. Funding has dried up for parapsychology on college campuses. There used to be parapsychology labs at Princeton, Harvard, Cornell, Duke, other places. Right now, they're gone. They're gone because of a funding drought. There is still an outstanding parapsychology lab at the University of Virginia, known as the Division of Perceptual Studies, which was headed up by a wonderful man, now dead, named Ian Stevenson, and continues to function in the good hands of his protege, Jim Tucker, both MDs. Stevenson was dedicated to studying instances of probable reincarnation, a fascinating field in which he assembled thousands of case files that demonstrated physical and other evidence um, for the possibility of a child or a grown adult evincing definitive traits of someone who had died almost always unknown to them in some previous era. It's a very exciting field, and it touches on the after-death survival question as well. So, parapsychology, despite media onslaught and funding cuts, has continued to soldier on. I try very hard to talk about these issues with verity. Skeptics will not debate me. I have invited two big shots to debate me. They've both dodged me. I'll keep trying. I have done a good job, I think, of creating a popular literature because I write as a layperson. I am not a scientist and I am not a clinician. I am a layman, but I've done a good job of creating a popular literature that I think provides a counterpoint to some of the flat out wrong information that exists on Wikipedia. And I don't like saying this because I'm not by nature this optimistic guy, but I am hopeful about the field. I am hopeful about the field for the simple reason that the data that's coming out is just pristine. And I have this idealistic belief that truth survives all onslaughts. I also believe that as AI develops further and further, and we're really still in the nascency of AI, but as AI develops further and further, it will do more to elucidate the verity of the data that I've been describing to you and will provide a compelling alternative to Wikipedia, which does many good things, but it does not do any good to the field of parapsychology. Those articles are spiked by an ad hoc roving group of activist skeptics who just don't understand the field and don't want to understand the field. I'm also very excited by the nascency of quantum computing because I think evidence unsought is evidence most convincing. And Google engineers and Microsoft engineers, I can assure you, are not looking to make a statement about metaphysics. They're just looking to make the world's fastest computers. But they will find something that is so extraordinary, and they will report it, as did the Google engineers. And it deepens our whole view of reality, and it justifies, it buttresses the facts that have come out of parapsychology research over the past 100 or so years. So I really want to say a thank you to Sally and to you all for letting me spend a little time with you today. I mentioned earlier that the great Charles Honorton was age 42 when he died. That was an error. He was 46. I just want to correct that. We have to get our numbers right. And I thank you all very much for allowing me to speak to you. And I'd be very happy, time permitting, to take some questions or comments.
Mitch, thank you so much for sharing this fascinating material with us. It's always a treat to hear you talk about it. And I'm sure that the students have some questions. Of course, I always do. So I'm opening it up to all of you. What would you like to ask about that came to mind while he was talking?
Can you repeat the school in Virginia? I really want to look that up.
Oh, sure. That is the Division of Perceptual Studies, or DOPS, at UVA, University of Virginia. They have a very good website. And boy, discovering the work that Ian Stevenson did is a real adventure. It's a real adventure. And let me tell you, you could look at his work and say, wow, reincarnation, that sounds more controversial than ESP. And maybe in a way it is. But he was paid respect, even by skeptics, including in a column in Scientific American. Um, he was a great scientist, and all the greater for approaching a field that is so controversial.
And he was an MD?
Yes, he was a psychiatrist, Ian Stevenson.
Wow.
And there are lots of books that he wrote that you could find
That's right.
through Interlibrary Loan, even if it's not in your regular library.
Right. And you can find one of them if it's still up there. Internet Archive posted one of his books, uh, one of his earliest books. I think it came out in 1966, called 20 Cases Suggestive of Reincarnation. 20 Cases Suggestive of Reincarnation. And in that title, you hear the man itself. You know, these figures that I've been mentioning, Darrell Bem, Louisa Rhine, J.B. Rhine, Ian Stevenson, Jim Tucker, you'd be surprised how moderate in tone they are. They knew the incendiary nature of this material. They're not harboring any illusions about acceptance. And for that reason, they work all the harder to get it right. And that's what I love about them.
I have a question.
Sure.
Okay. So Gansfield study, that's one of these studies where they're using this deck of cards, the Zener deck.
Zener, yeah. Zener, yeah.
Yeah, did you say that was the Gunsfeld?
Well, anyway, I want to refer to like the Zener cards per se.
Oh, okay.
Okay. So you mentioned before about quantum computers, you mentioned AI, and it occurred to me, has anybody tried to do a Zener study with a quantum computer or a large AI system?
It's a great question. Not that I know of. I'll help you fill out a grant application for it. That's a wonderful question. Computers are, of course, being used in other ways in parapsychology. One of the precognition experiments that Dean Radin and Darrell Bem, Julia Mossbridge, and other wonderful dedicated researchers have been repeating over the past couple of decades is a precognition study using computers that demonstrates that if you are shown emotionally triggering images, maybe a violent image, maybe an erotic image, but some kind of emotionally triggering image, the body, seconds or milliseconds prior to the image appearing on the screen demonstrates maybe stressors or some kind of arousal response, like secretion of adrenaline, raising blood pressure, sweat. So the idea being that the triggering image will be alternated with more benign images. And Dean Radin, I would say, who's active researcher right now at the Institute of Noetic Sciences in Northern California, raises all his money on his own. Um, Tough. It's a job in itself, as any of you know, whoever filled out a grant request. Dean really pioneered that aspect of the field. And I expect that as quantum computing reaches the public and as AI gets better, because it's still really in its nascency,
Right.
those opportunities are going to open up.
The idea that as humans are programming AI systems, that they're actually also sort of incorporating their own neurosis and their own stereotypes. And whether they realize it or not, I mean, it's probably happening.
Yeah.
Therefore, maybe some form of ESP might eventually happen as well. I don't know, I'm just thinking.
Yeah. Well, the right now in 2025, AI is nothing more than a glorified search engine. It's
Yeah.
great at collating among stuff that we human beings in our imperfection have fed it. Um, the 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 engineers, the founders will tell us, but don't worry, AI is going to get better and better,
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah.
going to foster its own channels of information and its own methods of information gathering. That's the ideal. Whether that happens, we'll find out. We don't know yet.
Yeah. To me, that seems kind of like Nirvana. They're
Exactly.
thinking about Nirvana. That's
What
I
could go
think.
wrong? It could possibly go wrong. Yeah.
What
So
could possibly go wrong?
it's still in its nascency. Um, and we'll see what happens. But Wikipedia does so many great things. If you want to know about the Napoleonic Wars, go to Wikipedia. But as far as parapsychology, it's a travesty. So I'm willing to wager my chips on AI, and we'll see what happens.
Yeah.
One quick question. Years ago, Deepak Chopra was very popular, and he brought the discussion of quantum physics to the West, kind of. But that's not studied, right? That's not like these people you were mentioning are not of that ilk, right? That was
Well,
to make money.
I would say Deepak is more of a spiritual counselor, a health counselor, a wellness author, does many, many good things in terms of bringing public attention to some of the topics I've been describing. But the folks I'm describing, they are
I
research
forget.
based scientists. Yeah. And Deepak is too. He's a cardiologist. He wrote a wonderful book on quantum physics with a physicist named Manos Katalfos. He's wonderful, but his work is chiefly as a public wellness figure. And these guys and women that I've been describing, they are lab-based clinicians.
Okay. Thank you.
I have a question. Thank you for speaking with us. So many people feel that they have some kind of a skill with clairvoyance, ESP, or something like that. And do these scientists ever study how people develop those skills and how to go about developing those skills? And are those skills something that is normal for the human brain to be working on? Do they study anything like that?
That's a great question. And I guess earlier on, maybe that question divided the field. Um, J.B. Ryan, for example, took what I would call the X-Men approach. He felt that ESP was the assignation or the born gift of remarkable individuals. So he was kind of like Professor X. And he said, look, before we determine whether ESP is general to the human population, let's determine whether it exists at all. So my wish is to work with individuals who seem uniquely gifted. Now, Charles Honorton, who was a colleague of Sally's. Honorton, who I never had the opportunity to meet because he died so young, um, he was more interested in whether ESP was general throughout the population and whether there were certain settings that would evoke ESP. And that's where he ventured and I think succeeded in determining that this state of hypnagogia is prime time for ESP, so to speak. And what's so exciting to me about that is that you don't need a deprivation chamber or any fancy equipment in a certain sense. That hypnagogia occurs naturally twice a day, just for drifting to sleep, just for coming to. In my books, I've written that that's a period of time with which the individual may want to experiment in terms of visualization, in terms of affirmation, maybe in terms of ESP potentialities. Um, so that's partly, and Otterton's numbers surpassed JB's own quite significantly. If JB was getting a deviation from chance by say 2, 3, 4 percentage points on aggregate, Honorton was getting a deviation from chance about double that. So it's pretty exciting. It's pretty exciting. Um, JB didn't believe a person could train for ESP. I don't know whether Honorton, maybe Sally could shed light on this, believed that the individual could train for ESP so much as certain conditions abetted ESP. JB did make this observation, and I ask you to listen to this very carefully. He said that when occurrences of ESP appeared in the lab, usually it was in an atmosphere of good spirits, enthusiasm, hopeful expectancy, an active interest in the experiments. And I think there's something valuable there in terms of cognition in general that should be paid attention to.
Can we go back for a minute to, I think you were talking about precognition and the prior effect where you show an individual a photo of a violent act or an erotic act or something like that, and there'd be a response before. So I have a couple of questions. One is the response before appropriate for what they're seeing? Like if you're seeing a violent image, are they going to be horrified or scared and all that? If it's erotic, are they going to be aroused? I mean, is there?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, we have known bodily um, correlates to fear, let's say, or to arousal, and so they were measuring for those correlates: blood flow, sweat, adrenaline, things of that nature, heart rate.
If you, I don't know, maybe this experiment was done in this fashion, but if you had somebody, a subject, and you said to them, please sit here in an hour, I'm going to show you a photograph. And then you had them hooked up so you can measure their response for that hour. And then at the hour, of course, you show them the photograph, whatever it's a violent act or erotic act or whatever. But how long a time before you show them the picture would there be a response?
Could be seconds, could be milliseconds, could be 2 seconds, could be a shorter amount of time, but before the photo appears on the screen.
Yeah.
Yeah. And one of the big problems you have in experiments like this, as any researcher can tell you, is boredom. This happened in JB's lab too. You're sitting there and you're like, all right, enough already, And that's one of the problems with lab-based study of cognition. You have to constantly figure out, how do I get skin in the game? How do I make this interesting? There are some who argue compellingly, including dear friends of mine like Jeff Kripal, who's the Dean of Humanities at Rice University, big supporter of this research. But, Jeff makes the case, look, you are too attached to lab work. Lab work is where ESP goes to die. You need to be out in the field testing this stuff in real time, and finding ways to prove it, which he has done. And I sympathize with his argument. The truth is we can do both because this research, if it isn't stifled, is very inexpensive. I mean, I cannot say that plainly enough. Zener cards, flashing images, tests. I mean, compared to the money that we as a society piss away on utter nonsense, this stuff is so inexpensive. So there really ought to be money for all of it. And that's my wish. I mean, that's something I certainly would like to see parapsychologists not have to go hat in hand looking for money. But that's the reality that we face today.
And I'd like to add just a little footnote to what you were mentioning, which is that it was a random number generator that would pick the target that was either erotic or problematic for someone.
Yeah.
So that the researcher did not know what was going to come up.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sally just made such an important point. I cannot tell you the the lengths that researchers go to assure randomness because their numbers are so good, the math is so good that no one can get them on the numbers. So they always attack them on the methods. There's one particularly nonsensical note that you'll find about Zener on Wikipedia. There's a chemist named Irving Langmuir who probably knows about as much about parapsychology as I do about Polynesian cooking. And he made the ridiculous and unsupported supposition that during JP's experiments, subjects were seeing the reflection of the Zener cards, this 5-suit deck of 25 cards, in his glasses. Never mind that, I wasn't there. So never mind that JP didn't wear glasses. Keep me and Buddy Holly out of the lab so nobody will see things reflected in our glasses. And I thought to myself, wow, man, that's the best you can come up with? It's sheer nonsense. But what Sally was describing is important because every measure is taken to ensure randomness.
But there are also other images that are a little bit more subtle, images of things like a sad person or a contemplative person or something like that, were that done did provoke reaction as well?
Well, they might have an image of, usually what they'll do is they'll alternate benign images like a flower or a car with triggering images, violent images, or erotic images. They're just trying to get images on the screen that generate a measurable bodily response and finding again and again, trial after trial, analysis after analysis, experiment after experiment, that in aggregate, on average, um, people are displaying a precognitive response.
Yeah. So if nobody else has a question, I'll pose one more.
These are good questions. Go ahead.
You were talking earlier about hypnagogia or hypnagogic state, for instance. So what do you think of Edgar Casey? And it sounds like that he was in a hypnagogic state when he was.
Yep.
What do you think?
That's a very good point. That's exactly, I mean, look, I can't evaluate the data emergent from Casey's body of material. I've written about Casey historically. I admire the man greatly. Have a whole chapter about Casey in my first book, which is called Occult America. Um, I have essays about Casey. One article in particular is called Ordinary Man, Extraordinary Messenger. I love the man. I can't evaluate the validity of his readings on whole, but he did seem to go into that sleep state that's very similar to hypnagogia, as you were just saying. So, yeah, I've made that association as well.
And my wife asked me a question once, and we talked about among ourselves, but you're here. Do people who use their ability a lot, are they subject to health problems?
Not that I've ever witnessed. I think that the greater issue with ESP, clairvoyance, telepathy, is that it can't be programmed. It can't turn on and off like a water faucet. It's not dentistry, I often say to people. There's an emotional component to it. It seems that we've been led to that answer. There's an emotional component to it. The data seems to support. There are methods under which people do better. The data seems to support. There's also a randomness to a degree because emotions need to be part of the game. I've never encountered there being compromised health. Sometimes, obviously, for the subject, fatigue does set in, as I think it would set in for any repetitive task, and that's one of the challenges of cognitive lab work.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Pleasure. Pleasure. Thank you.
Another question.
This is not, I'm gonna change the topic a little bit, but I'm interested a little bit in Reiki, spiritual healing. Are there studies about how well that goes and if there's proof of that and your personal thoughts on energy healing and so on?
Yeah, I've never studied energy healing. I'm familiar with Reiki. I'm familiar with certain techniques. I've never taken a deep dive into it. I will say the following. I think that in any therapeutic encounter, the rapport between the caregiver and the subject is so critically important. And I think extraordinary things can occur when that rapport exists. I mean, look at the placebo response itself. What is the placebo response really but hopeful expectancy? And via that hopeful expectancy, there are extraordinary, trackable, and statistically replicable occurrences of a therapeutic response and a lasting therapeutic response. And the trigger, or among the triggers, seems to be hopeful expectancy, which is the very same thing that JB found in the ESP lab. Hopeful expectancy correlates to results if there are going to be any results at all. And that's really worth paying attention to. Um, I am a generalist, so I'm allowed to extrapolate. And I would extrapolate by saying that if you don't find that in your job, in your life, in your education, start looking for alternatives because hopeful expectancy seems to be the thing that predicts whether there's any positive or desirable outcome at all.
Your books are on Amazon?
All my books are on Amazon. My most recent book is called Practical Magic, where I deal with some of this material. Big chapter in there on retrocausality. So if you want to know how you can spike your score in Sally's class after the fact, don't study beforehand. It's only a couple of percentage points, so don't start breaking out the champagne. But study beforehand, please. But study afterward too. I have a whole chapter in Practical Magic on how this works, and it's not easy to wrap our minds around because it's violative of how we go through life. But the data is real, and the theory is starting to catch up with the data.
Any
Thank
other
you.
questions?
Thank you, thank you.
Are we running out of time for you? Do you have something you have to get to? Or time for one last question?
I have to do something at 1, but I certainly have time for one last question.
Well, I was thinking that we're in the middle of a paradox when we do research and it's as your friend Jeffrey Kripal said, and he's, on one side of it, there's criticism from both the skeptics on one side and from people who feel that laboratory research cannot do the job because it's using physical means to try to entrap something which might have a non-physical explanation. So how do we justify laboratory research from the other perspective of Jeffrey Kripal's viewpoint?
Yeah, I've thought a lot about that, and it seems to me that, well, I'll put it to you in anecdotal form, but I think it holds true universally. Darrell Bem issued his paper on precognition and retrocausality in 2011. That paper is still being debated in 2025. It's been proven confirmatory. The results have been proven confirmatory in meta-analyses, and yet brickbats still fly over this thing. I would say when you're getting lab results that are that extraordinary, that are that paradigm shaking, if I can use that term, lab work still makes sense. Lab work is still effective. At the same time, the field work, as Jeff says, is more dramatic, It's more interesting, it's more vital, and it can be proven. And so I guess I would split the difference and say, let's do both. Let's do both. You know, figures like Dean and Daryl and Julia Mossbridge and Sally and others have worked within the lab setting and should keep doing so. Figures like Jeff and Eric Wargo and others who are writing in the field today, they've worked within the field and they should do so. You know, I simply can't accept that there's not funding for both. And my goal, if I have one, is to say enough about the field so that the funding loosens up a bit, so that all this work can be done. All of it, again, I can't emphasize enough. It's peanuts. It's peanuts, you know, compared to things that we piss away just bushels of money on.
Well, thank you so, so much for
Pleasure.
being here with us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Pleasure. Thank you all.
And I know that you have a website that has an email address.
Yes, my website is mitchhorowitz.com. It's just my name. My email is on there. I don't hide from people. So I want you to go on Wikipedia, find out that I'm wrong about everything, and then write to me and say, what is this? Yeah, and look at my articles. Go on to Substack. I have a newsletter on Substack called Mystery Achievement. And on that newsletter, you'll find a big article about Daryl Bem, a big article about J.B. Rhine and his Zener card efforts. And man, you will find footnote after footnote after footnote. Check them out. If I'm exaggerating something, if I'm getting something wrong, um, hold my feet to the fire, you know, because there's no place for exaggeration in this field. We're dealing with some very heavy material, some controversial material. People have dedicated their lives to this research, suffered a lot of professional calumny, and they didn't do it so that a guy like me could sit in front of you and exaggerate. I won't exaggerate. And I want you to check my sources and hold me to that.
Well, the field is lucky to have you as an advocate for it, and we're